Welcome to episode 208 of the Disorganized Wizards Club podcast. My name is Alex, joined as always by Adam.
What up?
And Cam.
Hello.
We're a group of Ottawa-based players that play just about anything and everything we can qualify for. We talk about decks, tournament stories, just about anything to help you and ourselves get better at Magic.
That's the plan. In fact, you will definitely get better than me, at least at Magic, because I got smashed in my recent games of Magic the Gathering on Arena.
Yeah, pretty big weekend this past weekend in Historic with lots of events run on MTG Melee. The most important one, of course, being the DWC Take Our Money event last Saturday, which was taken down by returning top 8 DWC competitor, Big Goon, playing 4-color midrange. And unfortunately, that means that the three of us unsuccessfully defended our money this time around. So we had to fork it over. All three of us dying, I believe, by round 5, was it?
Something like that.
I died in round 4. I started 2-2. Adam, you 0-2'd, right?
Oh, I 0-2 drop. Yeah, I lost to Yashar. I lost to that deck.
Yeah. And then
the round before it lost to somebody who I think lost to Big Goon just before that. But I unceremoniously left the tournament very early, losing to 2 of the top performing decks. But I didn't realize how bad of a matchup they were for Jund Sacrifice, man. I got absolutely dumpstered. No, it's no wonder that those decks are so popular in the meta right now. But yeah, it was a wake-up call how badly I got crushed.
Yeah, and then Cam lasted one more round than I did. But Adam, you played Jund Sac. I played Rakdos Sac. And then Cam, you played Sultai midrange. So, I mean, we all made pretty good deck choices looking at results from this past weekend, I think. But got stomped in our own event again for the second time in a row, unfortunately.
Yeah, but I had a great time because we all just hung out in Discord with other players and everyone was just hanging out in the Discord channel, streaming games and chatting and just having tons of fun. So it was sweet. Even just going 0-2, I just hung around. And then in between matches, I was giving people on the stream draft strategy for Kaladesh. Yeah, it was awesome.
Yeah, it was definitely a really fun stream. Good time. And we actually did legit coverage for the finals as well, which I keep forgetting to make into a YouTube video. But I'll do that. I'll get that up by this weekend. So if you want to check out the finals of the DWC Take Our Money event, you can head to YouTube for the Disorganized Wizards Club and check out that sweet content there.
Yeah, we weren't planning on doing coverage, but I guess luckily for us and for Stream, the people who were in our top 4 or top 3 had participated in previous tournaments, so they knew how to stream for us, and everyone just set it up like immediately. And yeah, it was pretty sweet having impromptu coverage.
Yeah, actually, I think our top 3 competitors all of top 8'd or even top 4'd events of ours before. So some returning big hitters for sure. The event was super fun. Looking at our top 8 right now, we had 4-color midrange in first, Rakdos Arcanist in second, Sultai midrange in third, 4-color control in fourth, Is It Phoenix in fifth, Mono Black aggro in sixth, and then Sultai midrange taken 7th and 8th. So those Uro midrange decks definitely had a really good event. The one surprise of the day was Is It Phoenix, which is not a deck I've actually played with or run into at all in Historic so far. So it's really interesting to see that player make a deep run. This weekend really just solidified Sultai midrange as one of the most popular decks in the format. I think it was the most played in almost every single Historic event.
Yeah, I played a bunch of Sultai mirrors, like 2 or 3 out of my 5 rounds.
Yeah, I ended up playing Sultai in the SCG Championship qualifier on the Sunday. And I, honestly, this past week in Magic, between my games on ladder, my testing, the events I've played in, outside of the one SCG qualifier I played where I queued for the Sunday event, I don't even know what's going on, but I've been more unlucky in this past week than I ever have in my whole, call it a Magic career, I guess. And I don't like to complain about being unlucky because generally I'm pretty good at figuring out where I went wrong, the mistakes I made when looking back at my games. But some of these games were so unbelievably frustrating that you keep like 5 lands, Growth Spiral, and a spell in Sultai, and then you draw 6 lands off the top of your deck and literally don't do anything the entire game. Your opponent ults a Chandra on you, and you just watch and do nothing.
That is so miserable.
It's
Did
just
you remember
stuff
to,
like that.
Did you remember to rearrange your room and reorganize your kitchen after the daylight savings time change?
No,
Because
unfortunately,
if you
I
didn't, your feng shui is an hour behind, and of course that's going to impact your luck.
Oh my God.
Mm.
I was wondering, I was like, what is he going for here?
No, I
Yeah,
unfortunately
if your
did do
vibes
that.
are off by an hour, like it's just not good.
Yeah, I've just been
Yeah.
getting absolutely crushed. I had no idea what I was going to play on the weekend because the decks that had been performing well for me were no longer performing well. I was literally losing with every single deck I tried. The Take Our Money event was kind of my testing ground for Rakdos Sack. And the first couple of rounds went good. And then my deck just didn't function for 2 rounds. And that kind of really put me off it. But I probably should have just put more time into it and stuck with it. Because, looking at the results from this past weekend, Rakdos Sack had a really good showing. But I ended up audibling to good old trustworthy Sultai mid-range. And it betrayed me in the worst way. As I literally 0-3 dropped that tournament.
Ooh.
Rough.
Yeah, it was not good. But that freed up the rest of my day. Well, that's fine.
Yeah, the silver linings.
Yeah.
What do you think? Do you think it's just been bad luck probably? Just strings can like happen that way in Magic though, but they're disheartening.
So let's put it this way. So after Big Goon took down our event with 4-color mid-range, right? I took the deck out onto ladder to test it out. And my first 3 matches I play, I'm paired against colorless ramp, literally back to back to back. And I probably don't have to tell you how awful that matchup is, just theoretically thinking about it. But if you look at the actual win rate matrix from the historic this past week, and you take a look at 4-color mid-range versus colorless ramp, you have a 30.8% win rate versus that deck. And let me tell you, it felt worse because it literally just didn't matter what you did. They just crush you.
It's so funny though, isn't it so frustrating to lose that deck though when like you're insistent in a lot of ways? I mean, not you specifically, I'm saying like in your head, you're like, how do you beat any other deck in this format? Like you mop me, but come on.
Yeah. And so we had been playing Magic all day in the event. I've been testing some other decks, and then I queue up this winning deck for 3 matches in a row and just get by far your worst matchup in the entire metagame, three matches in a row. And at that point, I didn't even care. I was like, you know what? I'm off it. I can't do this. I can't play this deck. I know I'm getting super unlucky with pairings, but like I'm just so frustrated right now. I swear to God, if I queue up this list again, I'm going to lose my mind. So instead, I just net decked a list off Twitter when I woke up in the morning, still not knowing what I was going to do. And it didn't work out. I got smashed. So
I honestly, not since, I'm trying to think. I can't remember. No, well, the Luca deck. I was trying to think of a time where I picked up like a deck and not really played it and went into a tournament and done well. Probably not since the Luca deck, but lately, if I've been picking up a deck and trying it out, it just gets stomped. I don't know why. I think I'm worse at just playing metas in general from lack of playing in paper, maybe. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. So it was a frustrating weekend for me, for sure. But it is what it is. It's a new week. Got new stuff to talk about. We're going back to standard this weekend. Going to play in an SCG standard tomorrow. See if I can queue for Sunday. But I think I'm just going to play. I'm 2 for 2 now for just playing 1 satellite and queuing for the Sunday. So I think I'm just going to run that back. If I make it, I make it. If I don't, I'll probably just play World of Warcraft all weekend like I've been doing all this week. So,
solid plan.
Yeah. I literally haven't played a match of standard this week. All I've been doing is playing Shadowlands. So
Nice.
I think I'm just going to queue up one of my trusty Gruul aggro decks from last week or the week before and run that. I think standard's pretty solidified at this point, though. All the good decks in the format are known. They're all pretty close to 50% win rate, and it's just kind of format's been figured out. I don't expect we'll see much churn or major changes until the next set comes out.
What a world where standard is balanced, hey?
Yeah, actually. Yeah, and it's not like it's one or two decks kind of dominating everything. I feel like there's 4 or 5 that are all reasonable choices at any point. And from week to week, they just kind of go up and down like 3% in win rate, I'd say. So Standard's in a good spot.
Yeah.
Definitely
yeah,
a
it
good
really
spot.
is. Like 100. Yeah, it feels that way.
Yeah.
I can't wait for Cal time to just ranch it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. It's bound to happen. It's a pretty good track record of new sets ruining everything. But let's circle back to Historic for a moment. So major events this past weekend. Salte was by far the most played deck in our tournament, 19 or 20% of the metagame. The second most played deck was the other category, taking up 31% of our metagame. We had a lot of 1 copies in the tournament, but that kind of makes sense. It usually happens in smaller events like this, but our event was actually the biggest take our money we had ever run. I think how many players actually?
We had 74, if I remember.
74.
Like that.
That's a lot.
Yeah, we needed 10 rounds.
Yeah, it's by far the biggest take our money event we've ever run. So that was really cool to see.
No, yeah, I mean, not only was it a big event, we got a lot of really positive feedback, quite a bit. And people had a really great time. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're sweet. If it's a free tournament, you just get to come play. Double a limb, I think people actually enjoyed for it too, because their day was done when they lost twice. They don't have to worry about standings. They're just done for the day. And for a free, just quick, fun tournament, I mean, it's a good way to do it.
Yeah, I think the amount of rounds we played ended up being the same as Swiss and Top 8 would have been, but the event still went by quicker because of 2 losses, everybody's out, and then things just kind of moved faster outside of the melee issues that happened in round 1 or 2.
Oh yeah, we had some laggy. Well, they had to do a server reset, so it was a bit of a slow grind in the beginning, but no, we had tons of positive feedback all over the place. People were really happy to play in the tournament, and it ran really smoothly. So for listeners, make sure you come play the next ones. They're always come take our money.
Big thank you to everyone who signed up, everyone who tuned into the stream, came out to play. It was a lot of fun. So if you want to catch future events, DWC.gg has a link to our Melee page. You can follow us on Twitter at DWC Podcast 1, where we post all of our content and upcoming events. So definitely stay tuned for that. That'll be a lot of fun. I think we're planning to do another one next month, so stay tuned. But when it comes to Historic, we actually have a pretty good win rate matrix posted by MTG Data on Twitter, which I highly recommend shooting a follow to if you like keeping up to date with win rates in various metagames based on actual tournament data. I've found this Twitter page to be really useful, but we're looking at the Historic Kaladesh Week 1 win rate matrix, and we talked a lot about decks we liked and decks we didn't like on our episode last week. We said Sultai Midrange was by far the most popular deck. And looking at the amount of copies of this deck that came into events over the past week in Historic, it's by far the most played. Coming in just barely over a 50% win rate, which makes sense as it 309 players or 309 copies of Sultai Midrange competed in Historic events over the past week. And the next closest would be Goblins at 184. So realistic that we're a lot closer to 50% win rate here with the amount of decks in the format. Goblins was a deck we talked about last week that we kind of concluded that it was still around, but people had figured it out and were still packing the amount of hate. And I think we missed the mark a little bit there. Well, that might have been true on ladder. When it came to these events, you didn't quite see that pan out. There was a lot. It was the second most played deck across all events, and it had a really good weekend with the second highest win rate across all tournaments. So it feels like on ladder, Goblins had disappeared, but in reality, it was still kicking ass.
Yeah, in tournaments, I could see people thinking it just from their experience on ladder. Yeah, conflating both ladder and tournaments is a mistake that, we're probably going to make for a while, I think everyone's going to make for a while just because they're so different,
Yeah,
But
wildly.
it feels like your experience on each should be the same, reflected similarly, even though they're not.
Yeah, like the range of decks you're going to run into in Historic on ladder is much, much wider than the range of decks you're going to run into when it comes to actual tournaments like this with stakes on the line. So while you may only play against goblins once every 25 matches on ladder, it's going to be one of the most played decks if you're actually going to a real event. So it's something to consider. And I guess led us a bit astray when talking about the archetype last week. Really good performance from that. I feel like the breakout deck, well, I don't know if it's fair to call this deck a breakout deck anymore, but Rakdos Sacrifice had a huge resurgence this past weekend. Performed really well. By far the highest win rate across all archetypes at 62%. I think it put a copy into the finals of the SCG championship qualifier on Sunday. And I saw it performing really well in the satellite events as well. And I mean, this deck is, I don't think it has new cards. There's nothing really too exciting about Rakdos Sacrifice, but it's one of those decks that the core has proven to be good. And there's a ton of decks in the format that just can't beat it. I mean, I played in the qualifier that I played in that qualified me for the main event on the Sunday. I played the green-black henge deck that I brought to Versus a couple weeks ago. I made some changes, made it into a collected company deck, and figured I'd try it out in the satellite. And lost in round one to a deck I can't remember. I think it was Saltai. Won 4 in a row, and then was playing for a bye in the last round. Got paired against Rakdos Sacrifice, and that was the fastest 0-2 I've ever had. It was unbelievable how bad they smashed me. And I think that's just true for most creature decks in Historic right now, that Rakdos Sacrifice is just going to mop the floor with you. So,
I mean, look at the data from this deck. It has positive win rates against everything in the field except John to Sacrifice, where it's basically 50%. And then it's 30% versus 4-color mid-range. I mean, Yasharn going to do that, but it beats everything else.
Yeah.
Yeah, the big pig is the only thing that can really stop those decks.
Oh, man. That pig is just not remotely beatable if you're playing Sacrifice.
I know. I played, like I said, when I 0-2'd, I got game one, they played it. I was like, oh, that's how they beat us now. Hold on. I was looking through my deck list. I just can't win this game. I actually can't kill this thing. I can't do enough damage to it.
Yeah.
Game one, and then game two, it came down. That was it for me. Yeah, the card's super good. Otherwise, though, I don't think you can win with those mid-range decks, right? Like,
yeah. I mean, the Sacrifice decks could adjust a little bit and play more sideboard cards to be able to kill a Yasharn. But from almost every single list I saw, at most they were ever playing were like 2 Noxious Grasps. And in the 4-color matchup for Rakdos, Noxious Grasp is spread pretty thin, right? Because you have the 4 Nisses to contend with, and then usually 3 Yasharns to contend with as well. So either one of those are pretty bad for you to stick. And when you only have access to up to 2 ways to deal with both of them, you're going to run into problems, obviously.
oh yeah.
And this is kind of what we saw happen. You guys said you didn't watch it, but I watched the top 8 coverage of the SCG event. And it was Rakdos Sac versus 4-color mid-range in the finals. And in the second game, I think, or the final game, the Rakdos Sacrifice player Noxious Grasps the first Yasharn and then died to the second one plus a Nissa. So yeah, I think you need to commit a little bit more if you want to be able to beat it. 2 isn't going to do it for you. But I mean, at the end of the day, you could play 4 Noxious Grasps and more ways to beat it. And you're going to be sacrificing at some point when you're sideboarding that much, I guess. So I don't really know if it's worth trying to snipe that deck, but
I mean, if I was playing Rakdos Sac, I would make some concessions towards it. It's not like I desperately need my sideboard to be, well, I don't know, but it's not like I have other bad matchups that I need my sideboard for. Like, it's my only bad matchup. So if I contribute a few more slots to it, like, I'm not too concerned about that. And if all it takes for me to have a reasonable matchup is a couple extra sideboard slots against the deck that's main boarding the most hateful card in the format, it seems like a pretty good win.
Yeah, maybe what I'm trying to say is that I don't know how much you have to commit in the sideboard to swing that matchup in your favor, or if it's actually possible to do it.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, who knows?
It's just kind of wild to see how much the matchup swings because of Yasharn. Because if you look at Rakdos Sack's win rate versus regular Sultai midrange, it's 72%. And then as opposed to 27% versus 4-color. It's like, that is such a huge gap.
Yeah.
I mean, the 72%, anyone who's played that matchup knows, well, I mean, I would claim that it's almost entirely from Claim the Firstborn. Like, you just can't risk casting a huge Crisis. You can't really risk leaving your Uros out. Like, Claim is so hard for the Sultai deck to play against.
Mm-hmm.
But Yasharn is very hard for Rakdos to play against, so it's wild that it's like a 40% swing.
Yeah, it's crazy. I don't know. Some other decks in the format that performed well this past weekend. Junsack, in the same vein as Rakdos Sack. Not quite as high as of a win rate, but still pretty good at 52%. 4-color midrange had a good weekend as well, taking down not just our event, but also the SEG event. Zorius Auras bit over 50% as well. That was a deck that we talked about that we liked more than its counterpart in Orzhov Auras. Azorius came in at 53%. Orzhov came in at 46%. So got that one right at least. And then I guess the surprise for me was Colorless Ramp, because I didn't expect to see too much of this deck, and it was the least played out of the major archetypes in the format, 31 copies, 52% win rate. But I really think this win rate is just piggybacking off its easy win versus Sultai and 4-color midrange, as obviously those two decks together make up by far the most played deck in the format.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you're farming that deck, but you're looking real bad against the second most played deck in the format, Goblins. 8% win rate versus Goblins. So you have a little bit of a problem matchup there. And then against some other popular decks, against Gruul, against Auras, you're looking real bad as well. So
yeah, really interesting, all these stats. Finally getting some, well, I mean, I say finally, I'm just so used to not having data like this, but we're getting more and more of it now. So if you're looking to dive into Historic or prep for some Historic events, definitely reference this, see if your sideboards can tweak it a bit. It's nice to have these numbers.
It's definitely still a fun format. I've been having more fun playing Historic than I have been playing Standard. But
Historic is a wild format. I love it. I think it's actually quite skill intensive. There's room to brew. There's a lot going on. It's a pretty fun format. There are some pretty borderline cards, but that's going to happen.
Yeah. There was one big Standard event this past weekend, which was the finals of the CFB Clash. And I actually have no idea which deck won this tournament. Do you guys know?
No. Let me see if I can find out. Yeah, I don't know.
It looks like, I'm pulling it up right now. Looks like it was taken down by Teamer Midrange. First and second, Teamer Midrange, Teamer Ramp. Both these decks are almost the exact same. They're the Obosh Adventures deck playing Genesis Ultimatum, Terror of the Peaks. This deck has like really exploded in popularity and performance over the past week and a half, I'd say. I've seen a lot of people tweeting about it, positive results on ladder, and it's been crushing some events.
That's actually like kind of a hopeful sign, because for a while there, every time I sort of paid attention to Standard, it was just Gruul Adventures, and it felt like it had stagnated a bit. But if there's a shake-up and still a couple new brews and some tweaking happening in the format, that's exciting, because there's like, a month or two left of it?
Yeah. Like the top decks in the format right now, I'd say would be Gruul Aggro, Mono Green Food, Teamer Ramp, and then This last one is kind of tough. It's probably either blue-black control, maybe Esper Doom, close, maybe Dimir Rogues. I mean, I could say either one of those three could take that last spot. But yeah, I think, based on events we've seen, by far still the best decks in the format are Mono Green, Gruul Aggro, and then this Teamer Ramp just kind of exploded and has been really good as well. Yeah, I think you couldn't really go wrong with any of those choices that I mentioned.
Yeah.
I think decks like Mono Red, Rakdos, those decks you kind of want to forget about at this point. Maybe even Esper Doom. Maybe its time has passed, I'd say. Everything else wouldn't talk shit about your deck choice.
I mean, Doom Foretold seems pretty good. Like, if Mono Green Food is quite popular because, like, they're going to be committing to the board. They're going to have, like, a goose and a creature and a trail of crumbs. So long as you can feed your Doom Foretold, like, Doom Foretold interacting with their non-creature permanents is pretty hard for them to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, Doom Foretold also in the statistics they have, at least from a couple weeks ago. I haven't looked at the same MTG data recently that we have pulled up for Historic, but Doom Foretold's win rate is also fairly high. Because it can answer a lot of questions, but I don't know. That was from a couple weeks ago. I don't know if it's changed now.
As of November 15th, the win rate for Esper Doom Foretold versus Mono Green was 37%.
Huh.
Yeah, it's pretty low.
So I think the data disagrees with you, Cam.
Yeah, well, it's been a while since people had to listen to data,
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's a pretty miserable. Yeah.
Wow.
I wouldn't think that matchup is good, though. Like, I played a lot of Doom Foretold. That matchup not good.
Yeah.
There's a lot of there's a lot of problems that make all your draws awkward. I don't know. It's just not great. But you're pretty good against a lot of other things.
Well, based on this win rate matrix, the only matchup outside of Rakdos midrange that you were positive against was Gruul. Everything else was under 50%.
Yeah, because before that it wasn't. So I don't know what changed. Like, if you go back, or
I think it's just one of those things that all of the decks just adapted.
Yeah, they probably just they just not getting caught by it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Like, Doom Foretold is a pretty eminently beatable strategy, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, this data is from the week of the 9th to 15th. So still about a week and a half ago. So things, I mean, as we've seen with Arena, and things change quickly. So don't want to base too much of your opinions based on the numbers we're saying right here. But
yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm sure that even with some changes, you can make it so that your Doom Foretold deck can start winning again. There's lots of updates and changes you can make.
Yeah.
Different versions of it too. Like, we're talking about Esper Doom Foretold. I played against a Mardu Doom Foretold version earlier. Like, maybe you switch stuff up. Maybe you just need some Omen of the Forge.
Yeah, that's the thing. You can always switch deck lists. It's not like these are written in stone, That's the thing that's, great about Magic is, you don't auto lose. You can fix things. Mm-hmm. But yeah, Doom Foretold on the decline isn't super surprising. Even just one enchant removal can kind of kill them.
Yeah, it'll just ruin your entire game plan.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, all right, get this problem permanent out of here. Oh, they had a disenchant.
People were definitely playing a lot more enchantment removal last time I dove into standard, so it makes sense.
All right.
Yeah, we can hop in.
I'm going to admit to the audience here, I'm blanking on a smooth segue, so I don't know. If you think of something clever, let me know. Maybe we'll edit it in after the episode is released. But our topic today is about secondary possibilities in Magic and trying to identify when you should give up on your main game plan and start, using your cards in alternative ways. And so we just wanted to go through some examples of scenarios where you should do that and scenarios where you should not, just to kind of emphasize the type of flexibility you should have in Magic. And so this topic was actually inspired by games we played in Versus. In particular, there was a game Adam played against me where he kept a hand that was kind of speculative. The hand could win sort of corner case games. Unfortunately, we don't remember what hand this was, but it could win some corner case games, but it wasn't really what the deck's main game plan was. But, it's interesting. Maybe it works out. And he kept it and ended up losing. And we were wondering, like, was that unlucky or, should you be analyzing these hands? And so that's sort of the idea for this topic. While you're playing, while you're mulliganing, while you're sideboarding, well, sideboarding less so because that is where you switch plans, but just while playing and mulliganing, how committed should you be to the game plan your deck had in mind when it was constructed? So we want to start with some examples of scenarios where you should switch your game plan, where you should reassign the purposes of the cards you're using. And a very good example of this was from Versus last night, where, I don't know why Stelly was complaining about losing to a Chandra emblem earlier. They're pretty easy to beat, as this story will indicate. So yeah, in Versus last night, I was playing Blue-Black Rogues, and Stelly was playing a Grixis Vehicles list he had brewed up. And my early game was not great, and Stelly had resolved and used an uncontested Chandra for a few turns, and made a Chandra emblem. My hand was like 3 Drown in the lock, and I had a Soaring Thought Thief in play. Now, the initial game plan of Rogues is to, in particular of Rogues versus Grixis Vehicles, is to use the Drown in the locks to counter Planeswalkers and otherwise hard to answer threats. Like, unless you're really set up and have a pretty wide board, you can't really attack down most Planeswalkers that quickly. Like, your creatures aren't that big. They're maybe 2 or 3 power. So you sort of need your counter spells to efficiently deal with Planeswalkers. And in normal circumstances in a game, you wouldn't counter something like a creature or even a Heart of Kiran because you would save it to counter the Planeswalker, relying on your spot removal to answer the other threats that they have. And you also wouldn't use it to protect your creatures because your creatures are kind of bad. You need the counter magic, as I said, for the Planeswalkers. And, you're a Lurrus deck. Like, if they kill your creatures, so what? Eventually you can get back a Lurrus, so long as you're not dying to Planeswalkers. That's the usual plan. But in this scenario, facing down a Chandra emblem, my literal only way to win is to race. If I patiently wait to counter Planeswalkers, like, I'm just going to take 5 as he casts them. It doesn't matter if they're resolving or not. So every card in my deck has to be, like, repurposed. The Drown in the Locks are now no longer about preventing Stelly's threats. They are only there to keep my threats alive. And so I started countering removal spells on my creatures just to be able to race. Now, I probably shouldn't have won this game, but Stelly only drew 2 spells when I was at 13 life, so I lived at 3 and killed him. Pretty unlucky that he drew a lot of lands, but that was literally my only way to win. If I had not protected my threats with these Drown the Locks, if I had not repurposed them, then Stelly would have had enough time to draw a 3rd spell and I would have lost because I don't have life gain. So that's one example where, like, as soon as the game state reached a point where, now it's me versus Chandra emblem, a lot of the cards in my deck have to get repurposed. A classic example from a game Adam played a long time ago in Legacy, and I think this story has been included in the podcast before. Maybe Adam can tell it since...
I was playing against a lands deck with Punishing Fires, and I was playing Delver, and I had wastelanded a single Grove of the Burn Willows very early, and they went to Punishing Fire, and I Force of Willed. My opponent was pretty upset about the Force of Will and the Punishing Fire, saying, oh, this is ridiculous. I'm just going to get it back. But my hope was they just didn't draw Grove of the Burn Willows, another one, or get a way to get it back, and I just magically get there off the Delver because I can't win otherwise if they ever draw it. My hand is just Delver. I just have to protect it and pray. And I put every resource I had into protecting that Delver and won that game, much to the chagrin of my opponent. And I think normally, statistically, it wouldn't be the case. But that matchup, for people who are familiar with Legacy, can be so bad. Well, it depends on the Delver deck. But the build I was playing was so bad that I couldn't win, that it required me to completely work my game plan around the fact that I wastelanded a Grove of the Burn Willows early, and maybe they couldn't pick up their Punishing Fire after I forced it,
Yeah. It's a similar scenario to the one with the Chandra emblem. Like, there's rather than an emblem being your adversary, it's just such a bad matchup that you're so unlikely to win anyway that you have to kind of go all in on the one way that you might win. You can't delay the game. You can't, because if you had tried to play slow, they would eventually find another Grove or saw another Punishing Fire, and then you definitely lose.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So yeah, that's an example. And the third example I have here of switching up game plans. So at GP Montreal, this was Throne of Eldraine Limited. I had a pretty grindy blue-green ramp deck. Had, some mana dorks, a lot of 5 drops. The one with, like, the giant with adamant. Had a Gadwick. Had a midnight clock. Like, really slow. Trying to cast big things and eventually win after stabilizing. And there was a game 3 I was playing where I had, like, a perfect 7-card hand that I mulliganed away. And then, like, a perfect 6-card hand for, ramping, interacting, casting 5 drops. Then mulliganed that away as well, despite both of these perfectly playing towards the game plan the deck had in mind. And I kept a 5-card hand that had, like, 3 lands, 2-drop, 3-drop, because I was doing this while there was, like, 5 minutes left on the clock, shuffling wildly. And I needed an aggressive start to have any hope of winning that game. And I guess my opponent either got unlucky or didn't mull with the clock in mind, and I just curved out and killed him, playing as fast as I could.
The dream.
Yeah. But I mulled towards that. Like, my normal plan in that scenario would have killed me. And so across these 3 sort of somewhat disparate examples, the point I wanted to emphasize is that these are all very extreme scenarios. Like, playing against a Chandra emblem is not normal. A matchup that is so bad that you, like, are basically 0% to win game 1 is usually not normal. Playing with, like, trying to finish a game in 5 minutes in the last part of a round is not normal. These are all such rare and extreme circumstances. And I think those are really the only times when you should abandon the primary plan of your deck. Like, what we're going to try and emphasize here is that the scenarios where you deviate from your primary plan and you start using cards in ways that you didn't intend to use them normally requires such strange circumstances. And it's usually pretty rare that you should do this. And it's generally when you have to or you will lose. And there is no other way that you can win these games. They're very, very, like, severe circumstances. And to kind of demonstrate the opposite side, that you shouldn't be doing this so often, I have some examples of play patterns that I've seen people make, or play mistakes that I've made myself, which are switching plans when you shouldn't be. In normal circumstances, in the midst of playing regular games, you start repurposing your cards and trying to switch plans away from, what your deck was built to do, what you had those cards in mind for. You start trying to freestyle, and it usually punishes you. Like, usually you don't have to do these things, and it's bad to do them. Otherwise, that would have been the purpose of the cards in your deck. So a good first example, Thought Seizing. I think if you give people a deck with Thought Seizes in it, and their draw involves a single Thought Seize, they'll use it well. That'll be fine. They'll understand the purpose of the Thought Seize is to, they'll mix it into their curve to try and disrupt their opponent. If they have a 2-drop and a 3-drop, they'll use it turn 1. If they have a tap land turn 1, they'll probably play that. They'll save it so their opponent draws an extra card so they can have a better Thought Seize. People are pretty responsible with their first Thought Seize. But if you give people, like, 2 Thought Seize and a Kroxa, suddenly they just lose their mind. They see in their hand the fact that their opponent will not have a hand. And they'll just Thought Seize, Kroxa. Like, they'll just go all in on casting these hand disruption spells, thinking, like, oh, I have so many of them. My opponent's not going to have any cards left. My hand can do this. My hand can completely strip my opponent's hand. Therefore, that's what I'm going to do. But that's never the purpose of hand disruption spells. It's never, like, strategies that try to entirely deny your opponent having a hand are usually not good. It's far too ambitious of a goal, and it's soft to top decking. That's not really how hand disruption is used. And when people play this game, when they just go all in on hand disruption, it's not uncommon. Like, sure, your opponent has no cards, but neither do you. You cast all of them. And your opponent's been making land drops or doing whatever else, what second thing you're not taking. And then they top deck something better than you, and you just lose because all you did was Thought Seize them.
It's also scientifically proven that 75% of the time your opponent top decks the card you Thought Seize out of their hand. So take that with what you will.
Yeah. But I mean, those hands, like, you don't have to play those hands that way. Like, sure, you have 2 Thought Seize or 3 hand disruption effects, whatever. You can just maintain the initial plan of how you intended to use Thought Seizes. Like, if you're worried about Nissa, you can just wait until turn 4 and Thought Seize before their turn 5, having given them the maximum amount of time to draw a Nissa so that you are most likely to take it before they cast it. Like, you don't have to just cast them all.
Yeah.
Perhaps you're playing against a control deck. You can just wait and save one until you need to use it to get a counterspell out of the way so you can resolve something else once you have enough lands. Like, just because your hand can go into this pseudo discard strategy, that isn't how you planned to use Thought Seizes. It's not the strategy of your deck that was built, not the strategy your deck was built to do. So just don't do it. Just play patient. Just use the cards the way you intended to. Don't get like distracted by this shiny strategy out of the corner of your eye.
But it's so shiny.
It is. It is. And so, yeah, unless I don't know what extreme circumstance you would need to justify something like this, like, yeah, you just don't have to disrupt your game plan that much. And speaking of like getting distracted by shiny things out of the corner of people's eyes, how many times have we been doing coverage? Or, I mean, I know I've been playing games and I've done this. You guys have probably done it as well. You're in some narrow circumstance where you have a game plan in mind that you need. Like, maybe you're a control deck and you need to find a Wrath because you don't have one. Or maybe you're an aggro deck and you need to find a land drop so that you can play 2 cards at once. And you scry, or we see someone playing scry, and they see some other shiny card which isn't what they need, but who knows, maybe it'll be good, and they leave it on top and then they lose.
All the time. Constantly.
Like,
I
yeah.
do it to myself.
Right. It's so common to just think like, I know I was looking for A, but B's here and B could be good and maybe I'll need it. So you leave it on top. And then you're never able to cast B because it's not what you needed, and you don't find A in time and you lose. And it's the same sort of idea of like knowing what you needed to be doing is your primary plan, but abandoning it for a secondary plan in circumstances that don't require it and will punish you for pursuing that secondary plan.
Yeah, like one of the things that happened in that game that I was talking about, I wish I could remember the exact details. I just hate giving incorrect recall on these, is that I basically kept my hand and started playing as if the late game would turn into, some failed state for my deck when it, I couldn't win if it got there anyway. And it just made everything a mess. It was so bad.
The scrying one depends a bit on game state as well. Like, if you're in a comfortable position where the game's even or you're ahead, then yeah, you can maybe waste a scry pursuing a secondary plan, shoring up your answers, making sure you have a diverse array of cards to use. But in that scenario, your primary plan is just to stay ahead and shore up all your different outs. So like scrying such a way is still your primary plan. When you're behind, your primary plan is to find the one of few ways that you can not be behind. And so you can't afford to switch to a secondary plan there. So yeah, scrying, I think, is a good example of this. Really, all of these are just getting distracted by a shiny strategy out of the corner of your eye in scenarios you shouldn't. One that gets me in limited, and I've done this to myself a few times, I'll have like 15 cards left in my library in a limited game, and I'll check my opponent's library, and they'll have, 7, 8, 9, something less than 10 amount of cards left. And I'll assume, that's not very many. That's less than me. I'll just wait, and they'll deck themselves. And then I stop taking good attacks when I should, because I'm just, I'll just sit here and block. And I just stop playing to optimize the creatures in my deck the way I planned. I stop maybe drawing cards myself if the library counts are closer, because then I would deck out before them. And there's really no reason to do this, because a 7 to 8 card library, like, if they're not dumb, they're not going to draw cards. Like, that's 7 turns is a long time in a limited game. And almost every time I've tried this, that I've got distracted by the notion of milling my opponent out in limited, my passive play has allowed them to stabilize for the next few turns and develop a board state that I now lose to. I don't know if this has happened to you guys, but yeah, there's a few times where I just assume, I'm in a fine enough position that I can just wait and not do anything and just block.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And it doesn't work.
Yeah. That probably comes from not even understanding exactly what it is, right? This is the classic who's the beatdown dilemma, where you're not entirely sure and then it costs you the entire game.
Yeah, yeah. And there are that strategy would work if my opponent had 2 or 3 cards left. But I just overestimate how potent it would be. I incorrectly like the scenario was not extreme enough for me to fruitfully pursue that secondary plan. But I try it anyway because I think it would be funny. Like, it always feels great when you can just mill your opponent out because by just not doing anything and you just watch them lose. But I mean, oftentimes it's bad. Like, you shouldn't just give up your deck's game plan because maybe this other plan works out that you never had in mind when you built the deck.
Yeah, exactly.
And at least in coverage, watching tournaments and stuff, I think commentators emphasize this aspect of play, this sticking to primary game plans, most when covering very good control players. They'll often talk about their patience, or they'll talk about maybe their discipline, because control decks kind of very much have to do this. Like, if a control deck tries to pivot into resolving its threats and winning the game too quickly, it can get very punished for that, either by not having a counterspell up the time it needs it, or by losing a counter war, or whichever. And so I can't remember actual examples of players doing this. Guillaume Wafatapa comes to mind as someone that commentary has said this about. But in general, you'll see someone like Marshall Sutcliffe or commentary, maybe we've even done it. An opponent casts something and they'll think like, oh, the opponent tapped out. Like, now they can resolve their Teferi 5, or now they can Gear Hulk, or now they can whatever. And the control player just draws a card, plays a land, and passes. Understanding that even though my opponent has given me this window to resolve a threat, or even though there are things I could do here that look good, that's not my game plan. My game plan is don't lose until I have 15 lands. Then I'll use like 6 or 7 of those to play a threat while I still have all my shields up. It's just to play to not lose, and my deck is built to win games so long as I achieve that. I don't need to get distracted by this narrow window where maybe I can start winning quicker. So, especially in control mirrors, this comes up. Like Teferi 5 versus Teferi 5 mirrors, back when they were in Standard, or if you ever play them in Historic.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways that people think about it, or they used to, and this used to be a term you'd hear in coverage, is that one of the cardinal sins of the control mirror is missing your land drops. It doesn't always play out this way, but historically speaking, in the sort of draw go mirrors where you're countering and, you know, maybe casting some card draw spells, making all your land drops is essential, because it's eventually, because of the way your game plan is, going to come down to a battle over, you know, how many resources you can use at once in one turn. And, you know, whoever has the ability to do that is going to come out on top. And so making your land drops is often considered one of the essential game plans to control mirrors, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what players focus on. They focus on, you know, trying to resolve draw spells so that they can keep hitting their land drops, or keeping land heavy hands in control mirrors. But their early game is very much just land go. And let's say it's a complete mirror and you both have Teferi 5s. If you mistakenly think that there's a win, like if you deviate from this game plan too early and think, okay, in the past, I've watched control mirrors and the person wins by ultimating a Teferi 5. I have a Teferi 5 in my hand and 9 lands and I have 2 negates. I can resolve my Teferi 5 here, which will move me towards winning the game. Like, if you do that too early and you get blindsided by this, or not blindsided, but distracted by this like plan of, I can get a Teferi 5 going, rather than this slow accumulation of cards and my small advantages that control is actually trying to do, then your opponent can fight over that Teferi. You'll use your negates. You'll win the counter war. You'll get a Teferi in play. And then they will just play their Teferi while you're tapped out, tuck yours, and have mana up to interact with you anyway. Like, it's kind of a who blinks first. And you can trick yourself into blinking first by misunderstanding what your primary plan is, or by abandoning it because you think a secondary plan is achievable.
Yeah, exactly.
Or even just like, I did this, I think, over the weekend, or I do it to myself often, playing control versus creature decks. I often will abandon my primary plan of just remove their creatures, maintain my life total, don't die, get to the late game, in order to try and generate some sort of efficiency. Like, oh, I'll let this thing resolve and hit me because it's odd CMC, and that'll make my follow-up extinction event better, rather than just using my spot removal and saving the extinction event. This is the kind of the patience episode that we talked about with Wraths. Like, trying to let your opponent hit you a bit in the early game to get an efficient Wrath on turn 4 or 5 is actually being tricked by a secondary plan out of control. Like, if you have spot removal, you should just use it to keep your life total high and keep those Wraths as a failsafe. so that you get into the late game untouched, where you're going to just dominate your opponent. But I make this mistake all the time.
Yeah, I mean, the best wins are the best wraths are the ones you never cast, right? You just win the game with it still in your hand.
Yeah, but and I understand thinking like, well, this wrath is here to cast it to get their creatures, so I'm going to try and set that up. And I don't fault people for maybe if you didn't know this or if you don't experienced playing control decks trying to set this up because it's a 3-for-1, it's a whatever, like it's nuts. But that's actually a secondary plan, and you're being tricked by yourself. All of these examples are just to kind of try and contrast the examples we started with. Like most of the time, in normal scenarios, abandoning the primary plan of your deck, either because you get distracted by a secondary option, or because maybe you never understood what the primary plan should be if you just picked up a net deck or something, that's gotten me as well. But in most scenarios, it's like very bad. It's self-sabotage, and you're not setting up to support the late game that your deck is supposed to have if you supported it correctly. Like you just kind of throw your entire game into this narrow corner case that is probably not even suitable for the scenario you're in.
Yeah, like think about the stories we're telling. Like the stories, I remember the games usually where the playing towards a corner case worked because it's such an unusual occurrence. Right, like the odds are stacked against you. So even like the example I give with the Delver deck, or the examples these are extreme corner cases, right? Usually they wouldn't pay off. And in fact, abandoning a lot of your game plans that way, I mean, the Delver example though is kind of the Delver game plan, just protect the Delver. But I just mean, forcing and punishing fire when they can pick it up, kind of thing, right?
Yeah, that's like unusual, but
generally speaking, you're gonna walk yourself into a trap. You see it all the time by people. Yeah, they keep a hand because it has a sideboard card, for example, the same thing, but their primary plan isn't there. Thought seizes, right? Just like Cam said, can happen. The same thing can happen with sideboard cards, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, you keep a hand that. I mean, I've won games when Historic was new, or maybe it was when Pioneer was new. Yeah, Pioneer, because it was in paper. I was playing like Elder Deep Fiend Emerge deck. It uses the graveyard a lot. It had prized amalgams, and I've won games against Jund decks that go like turn 0 Leyline of the Void, turn 1 play a Grafdigger's Cage after they mulled the 6, and now they have 3 cards, and I just cast amalgams and attack them, and they have nothing else going on because they like audibled when they saw their hand to a secondary plan of trying to lock me out, which is similar to the thoughts, like spending all your thought seizes earlier plan, thinking that it'll lock them out, and it just doesn't work because their primary plan isn't there. They're not doing anything else.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think outside of these specific examples or specific interactions that maybe people have experienced, I think the best experience or the best example of an experience in Magic that everyone has experienced that emphasizes why you should not switch to a secondary plan and why it's bad is the following. Everyone has had a game where you're looking at a 7-card hand, trying to decide to keep or mulligan, and it's game 1 and you're in the dark. You don't know what your opponent is playing. Your hand is very good in some matchup, so you keep it. Maybe it's like all lands and a win con and a counterspell in a control deck. And then your opponent goes like land 1-drop, and you realize your hand is entirely wrong for the matchup and you just die. This experience of keeping a good hand for the incorrect matchup is basically equivalent to committing to a secondary plan, which is incorrect for the game state. You didn't know that, but that's what ended up happening. You now have a hand that is committed to a plan, which is not how your deck intends to play the matchup that it's in. And you just get rolled. It feels terrible. Everyone's made this mistake. Everyone goes, unlucky. How could I have known? And that's correct. That is unlucky. You couldn't have known. But this mistake of committing to secondary plans that are inappropriate for the situation or matchup is the exact same thing, except when you do know. If you do know what the matchup is, like if you did know it was mono red and you kept that slow hand thinking, maybe their start is slow and this will be a game where I get to the late game and this is a good hand. Like that's the equivalent, I think, of committing to these game plans in the wrong spot. And like no one would do that. No one would keep that hand if you told them it was mono red. They understand that this is wrong to do and it's an unfortunate thing when it happens due to luck. And I think maybe if you remember this example in this context, you'll realize in other scenarios that, like, if I choose to use my cards differently here, or if I choose to pursue this secondary plan, I've basically opted into keeping a hand I know is bad in this matchup.
Yeah. And there are going to be corner cases where it works, but generally,
Yeah. I mean, exceptions such as the ones we started out with are always going to occur in Magic. Any strange thing can happen. But just in general, I think people abandon their plan for interesting or novel or, spur of the moment decisions far too often. And the very good players who get praised for their understanding of a matchup who get praised for their patience and discipline are really getting praised for not doing that, for sticking to the plan they had in mind, for playing towards the game plan that was laid out before they even started the match. And they often get rewarded for doing so. So that's my rant. Stick to your primary game plans.
It was a good rant. It was a really good rant.
Well, thank you.
And on that note, we're going to wrap things up this week. Thank you all for joining the club this week. Make sure, as always, check out our sponsor, wizardtower.com, for all your Magic single needs. If you like the podcast, want to support more content from us, you can find us on Patreon, patreon.com/DWC Podcast. You can also find us on YouTube if you want to shoot us a subscription over there. We'd really appreciate it. Really trying to grow that channel over there, the Disorganized Wizards Club, on YouTube. And you can find weekly live streams from us, twitch.tv/Disorganized Wizards Club. And however you listen to the show, whether it's Podbean, iTunes, any podcast app, leave a review, rate the podcast, share it with your friends. Everything helps, keeps this thing growing, bring it to new listeners. Thanks for listening. Catch you next week.
Be sure to stick to your primary plan of listening to the DWC, and do not get distracted by secondary plans of other content creators or other podcasts.